When Mr. Thompson's dark secrets unravel, will I reclaim my home or become a sacrifice in his twisted game? You won't believe what happens next. The morning sun barely illuminated my new backyard when I stumbled outside, coffee in hand and still groggy from a night of moving boxes. What I found sent every nerve in my body into overdrive. A circle of robed figures stood chanting at the edge of my property, their eerie whispers mingling with the rustling leaves. A wave of dread washed over me as I recognized the smug face of Mr. Thompson, the banker who had sold me this house, standing smugly among them, a wide grin on his face. I hadn't just bought a house. I had inherited a past stand now. I was trapped in a nightmare. I felt my heart race, an ugly mix of confusion and outrage coursing through me. The shadows of the robed figures danced across the damp grass, their dark flowing cloaks moving in eerie synchronicity, as if they were part of some bizarre choreography. I stumbled backward, nearly spilling hot coffee all over my shoes. Mr. Thompson had given me the grand tour himself. How could he hide this? I could feel my stomach knot tightly, realizing that this was no ordinary real estate deal. Of course, Mr. Thompson had charmed me with his promises of a quiet neighborhood, amenities, and a great investment. Now that grin of his seemed to wrap around my gut like a vice. Did he know about this? Had he willingly sold me a house steeped in some cultish lore? My stomach dropped as I recalled the vague mentions in the neighborhood about the sacred ground when I moved in. It had felt more historical than threatening then. Now it loomed darkly above me like an ominous storm cloud. I tore my gaze away from the robed figures and dashed inside, my mind racing faster than my feet. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my phone, nearly dropping it in my hurry. As I punched in 911, I couldn't shake the thought that this wasn't merely a surprise encounter. It was an unwelcome invitation into a twisted reality I never wanted to be part of. The operator's familiar voice droned on the line, but I barely heard her through the rush of panic gripping me. My thoughts spiraled into a frenzy as I bit my lip, fighting back a wave of nausea and the urge to scream. The cult was a collection of misfits cloaked in secrets, and I had unwittingly bought property in their sanctum. As the operator assured me that help was on the way, I could hear the chanting growing louder outside. It took me a moment to realize they had shifted, moving deeper into my yard, drawing closer to the outline of my modest home with its peeling shutters and crooked mailbox. I stared out through the window, heart pounding, wondering if they could sense the turmoil brewing inside me. Hastily, I threw the curtains shut, sealing off their eerie presence. But dread seeped through the walls like a creeping shadow, as if they had somehow invaded my very thoughts. I had wanted a fresh start of haven away from the chaos that had stained my last rental. Instead, I found myself on the threshold of a nightmare, tangled in the web of deception spun by none other than Mr. Thompson. What kind of man sells a house steeped in cult history without a hint of its tainted past? As I peered out the window, I saw one of the figures break away from the group, gliding toward my patio. The word sacred echoed in my mind, a jarring reminder of the chants that pierced the morning stillness. A sense of foreboding flatlined my heartbeat. They were marked by purpose, and their eyes glinted as they locked onto mine through the thin glass. I gasped, a pulse of urgency surging through me. My new home had transformed into a battleground between the ordinary and the bizarre, with me caught in the crossfire. I stumbled back from the window, breathing hard, as the reality of my situation washed over me in waves. Perhaps I was foolish to think a fresh start would be easily won. Maybe I had overlooked the warning signs packaged under Mr. Thompson's charismatic exterior. Disillusionment settled over me like an unwelcome cloak. But one thing was crystal clear. I needed to take back control before it slipped irretrievably away. Little did I know, this would be just the beginning of a surreal confrontation that turned into a protracted battle for my home and sanity. The spirited chants outside morphed into an unsettling anthem for the days to follow, where each sunrise threatened to unearth deeper layers of a clash between their world and mine that I had never asked to join. As the police car finally pulled up outside, I felt an unsettling chill in my bones, as if a higher power was entirely uninterested in surrendering their hallowed ground. What would come next? The thought that sent shivers down my spine. In a world where realities collided, secrets cloaked themselves under layers of deception, and nothing was truly as it seemed. Perhaps the real contest was only just beginning. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows that danced ominously across my kitchen floor as I peered through the window. Days had turned into a blur of half-formed thoughts and rising anxiety, my coffee cooling in the mug as I watched those wretched figures. They were back, their presence unmistakable, standing disconcertingly close to the boundary of my property. Their chants reverberated in the air like a macabre lullaby, drowning out any remaining sense of normalcy I had clung to after moving in. And standing amidst them, with that infuriating grin plastered across his face, was Mr. Thompson, the very same man who had sold me this cursed dream. Frantic attempts to confront him had been futile, like grasping at wisps of smoke. By the time I'd muster the courage to step outside, he would vanish, seemingly absorbed into the walls of the community he deceptively wove together. Each encroaching dawn brought the robed figures back like a horrifying sunrise tradition each chant, each low hum, amplifying the panic churning inside me. I felt the very structure of my new life begin to buckle under their weight, and it terrified me. Desperation drove me to call the authorities, but my pleas were met with nothing more than dismissive shrugs from the local police. They exchanged subtle, knowing glances, warning me against disrupting community practices. Their nonchalance fueled my frustration. Was it a conspiracy? Had my quaint neighborhood become a haven for cult activity, sanctioned by both the community and its leaders? Each time I thought of that nightmarish reality, it felt like I was slowly losing my grip. Just when I believed I had enough evidence to take a stand, Mr. Thompson chose that moment to reappear, his smile disarming beneath the sickly light of my porch. You didn't really think you could just take over sacred ground, did you? He taunted, his tone dripping with mockery. The world around me warped as if I were ensnared in a grotesque theater. A shadow enveloped my thoughts. The walls of my life felt less like a home and more like the confines of a prison. I strained to meet his piercing gaze, but all I could muster was a steady pulse of fear. Inside, my heart raced with a tumult of rage and disbelief. I wanted to scream, to lash out, but the subdued horror of the situation held me hostage. How dare he threaten my peace? What if he could manipulate the very fabric of legality with the sway of his charm? Those unsettling chants outside crescendoed, a chorus of despair that intertwined with the taunting echo of his voice. I felt ensnared in a twisted reality that somehow had become my own. Days rolled into weeks, and the boundary between their world and mine blurred further. I found myself wondering if my new neighbors would still look at me with kindness, or if they viewed me as an interloper. I combed through the history of my home, investigating online and digging through possibly abandoned archives, searching for any mention of this cult, partly in fear and partly in desperation to prove myself to this community. But every lead turned cold. Mr. Quote. Thompson's grip felt like an iron vice upon me, and I felt utterly powerless to break free. One evening, after yet another futile attempt to speak with the police had ended in farce, I returned home to find an envelope slipped under my door. It bore no return address, only a hastily written message warning me that disturbing the cult's rituals would lead to dire consequences. I tore it open with trembling hands, reading the words with growing dread. Were they already threatening me? Was this part of their manipulation? My resolve began to solidify, fueled by outraged determination. If they thought I was going to back down, they had miscalculated. Fueled by a wave of adrenaline, I turned to the only person left who might help, a lawyer specializing in property disputes. We arranged a meeting in the tiny, dimly lit cafe at the corner of Main Street. My attorney, with her piercing gaze and sharp tongue, listened intently to my rambling account. She promised me that we had a solid case, but every time we put our foot down, the strange events escalated. Odd symbols appeared in my yard, and I could feel eyes upon me when I took the trash out at night. The tension grew palpable, coiling around me like smoke. I steeled myself, ready to fight back, but there were moments when doubt crept in like unwelcome whispers, cold and taunting. Perhaps I had underestimated what I had gotten myself into. And as I descended deeper into this chaotic fight, I knew one truth above all. This was only the beginning of a battle for my homie life, and I was utterly unprepared for the absurdity that lay ahead. In the days that followed, I realized that to reclaim my home, I'd need to dig deeper into Thompson's past, prepare for the confrontation I was sure would come, and discover the truths hidden beneath layers of deception. But would I uncover the secrets I searched for? Or would they remain just out of reach, lingering in the shadows, eternally taunting me? As the first light of dawn crept into my living room, I felt a tension knitting my brow into a tight line. I stood by the kitchen window, peering out as the faint sounds of their drumming echoed through the chilly morning air like an uninvited heartbeat in my home. The robed figures congregated again in my backyard, their chants hauntingly melodic and almost hypnotic. Each note wrapped around my chest, squeezing tightly as the realization washed over me. These were not just visitors. They were unwelcome interlopers, clinging to the bones of my property's past. To my horror, I noticed Mr. Thompson was there too, standing tall among them, a satisfied grin plastered on his face. It felt as though my life me once dreamlike new beginning was slipping through my fingers. The day melted away into a blur of anxiety and confusion that evening. Hours spent researching the property history had proven fruitless. Every search term intertwined seamlessly with their presence. I had envisioned a home filled with laughter and love, and instead, there was chaos just beyond my threshold, orchestrated by a man whom I once believed was trustworthy. I had surrendered my life savings to him, yet here he was, with an air of twisted triumph, enjoying the chaos he had unleashed. I resolved that I couldn't be intimidated any longer. I had to act before they turned my sanctuary into a circus of bizarre rituals. It was time to seek legal guidance. The search for a lawyer led me to a no-nonsense attorney named Elaine, whose piercing gaze was rid of pity. We met in a small cafe that smelled of strong coffee, the kind that could fuel a fierce battle. Over steaming cups, I poured out the insanity I'd encountered, those chants, the symbols they painted in the grass, how my home felt like a cage. As I spoke, her brow furrowed with concern. She assured me that we had a solid case against Mr. Thompson and his unlikely congregation. They cannot just claim your land as sacred ground. You have rights, she explained, her voice steady. I clung to her words like a lifeline, but little did I know that the moment we decided to act, the storm would only grow stronger. We drafted a notice, script etched with legal jargon, ready to serve in a powerful declaration that would affirm my ownership. The denouement, however, was anything but simple. As we prepared to deliver the papers, events spiraled beyond anything I could have anticipated. The cult's rituals multiplied, now more elaborate and intense. They left offerings at my doorstep, strange totems, crafted from twigs and dried herbs that reeked of something I couldn't place. Panic lodged itself deep within my throat. Every inconceivable marking splattered on my lawn brought me closer to a point of no return. And it didn't stop there. When Elaine and I set out to serve the documents one fateful afternoon, our resolve was met with a peculiar resistance. We saw them before we could even step onto my property, standing in a formidable circle, chanting ferociously, an incantation whose meaning was far beyond my comprehension. The atmosphere pulsed with a tangible energy, cloaked in tension, as if the air itself held its breath. I felt something in my gut twist violently, pressing down on me as the figures turned their gaze in our direction, their eyes glowing and empty. I knew then that the stakes had been raised, and their determination echoed every bit as loud as their haunting pleas. In the days that followed, I became hyper-aware of Mr. Thompson's insidious influence. It was confirmed to me on a particularly bleak evening when I received a phone call from my bank that turned my stomach. Someone had contacted them, weaving doubts about my financial stability. I felt exposed, swimming in secrets that threatened to drown me. Had he forged new alliances within the community? Had he woven a web so intricate that only he knew how to escape it? It left me to grapple with a bitter realization. What if I was losing more than just a house? What if I was on the brink of losing my very identity? Then came the moment that felt like the climax of a waking nightmare. A handwritten note slipped through my mail slot. It was anonymous, threatening me to leave matters be. If I continued to pursue the case, dire consequences would follow. Right then, I stood frozen in my living room, the weight of the chilling lines swimming in my ears. They were watching me. How deep did this rabbit hole go? My palms became clammy. I pressed them against my sides, shaky yet stiff with defiance. This wasn't just an ominous warning. It was a challenge, and it was clear my confrontation with the sinister past was only beginning. Each morning grew heavier, each sunrise brighter yet more deceptive, as their presence thrummed with unyielding determination. I refused to go down without a fight, driven by the strength rising within me. With my attorney by my side, I had to gather every scrap of evidence to take a stand that might become a line in the sand against something far greater and darker than I had ever imagined. Even amid the chaos unfolding around me, I learned that fear could be a powerful motivator, urging me to push forward instead of stumbling back into the shadows thick with uncertainty. Emboldened, I silently vowed to reclaim my territory not just for myself but for every single soul who had unknowingly strayed into the nightmare Duncan Thompson had curated. As the sun began to set over yet another day filled with increasingly bizarre occurrences, I gathered my courage and my resources. The battle for my homeland, perhaps my very way of life, had just begun, and I would not rest until I had claimed back what was rightfully mine. Little did I know, however, how bizarre and twisted the fights to come would be, as every path forward seemed to intertwine further into the dangerous web they had woven. As the clock ticked down toward the court date, the shadows of night crept ever closer, heavy with what-ifs and what-abouts. In the dim light of my kitchen, I stared blankly at the stacks of legal documents surrounding me. It felt like their very presence was mocking my spirit. With each passing hour, I anticipated that final showdown with Mr. Thompson, the man who had instigated this surreal nightmare, but nothing could have prepared me for the revelation that lay in wait. When the morning sun broke through the clouds, illuminating my life with harsh clarity, I would soon find that the truth had taken a gut-wrenching turn. The day of judgment dawned dark and ominous, rain pattering on the courthouse steps like a sorrowful dirge. I held on to Elaine's words, "We have every right to fight this," but doubt gnawed at my resolve. As I took my seat in the courtroom, my heart raced with both fear and anticipation. I had steeled myself for battle, yet nothing could have prepared me for the performance Mr. Thompson was about to unleash. He strode in with an air of undeniable confidence, a smirk playing at the corners of his lips. My stomach churned as I noticed the glimmer of something hidden in his eyes. Was it mischief? Or had he truly crafted another deceptive trick? When the proceedings began, Mr. Thompson stood, his voice booming with authority as he introduced a shocking concept that caught me off guard. He claimed the land was not just under dispute, but that it had been part of a spiritual vow, a pact with shadows of the past. The lawyer leaned in closer, while I felt the breath leave my lungs. Documents unfurled faded papers, declarations of ownership, and some bewildering script from a century ago that appeared butterfly-like, with frayed edges. I watched as my attorney processed every line, her feigned disbelief slowly shifting into genuine concern. To my horror, I caught glimpses of the judge's skeptical expression, a flicker of interest, as if this case held secrets he couldn't resist. My heart sunk, a weight settling in the pit of my stomach as I realized just how deeply unpredictable this spiral of madness had become. Nothing made sense anymore. I had dragged myself through an emotional battleground, only to be confronted with the dark underbelly of a corrupted system that seemed bent at the will of a maniac. Would this courtroom, a supposed sanctuary of justice, really bend to the whims of a charlatan? As my mind raced, juxtaposed against the cool deliberations of the courtroom, the absurdity of it all struck me with stark clarity. The legalities I had been fervently grasping began to melt like ice under the sun. "Mr. Thompson," the judge began, quirking an ashen eyebrow. "This land as sacred ground?" I wanted to scream for the world to see the truth, to break the chains that had shackled my dreams, yet I realized I had to harness the storm within me to remain steadfast. When my attorney turned to whisper reassurances, I couldn't help but feel an icy grip choke my hopes. How could we fight a ghost? An echo of history that seemed too powerful to confront. Anxiety cloaked me like a shroud. I had sold everything to claim this space, to reclaim my life, to rise from the ashes of my chaotic past. Yet here stood Mr. Thompson in his black suit, feeding the flames of despair with every word. It felt sickening, like he was ruining every sacrifice I had made, and conversation stalled into an agonizing silence that suffocated me. The case had morphed into a winding labyrinth, one that I was desperately trying to navigate without a map. With every twist and turn, I felt like I was losing ground, the stakes driven higher with every legal term ricocheting off the courtroom walls. As I sat there grappling with the uncertainties, I realized in that harrowing moment that the true battleground wasn't solely in that room, but deep within my own spirit. I couldn't afford to lose. I wouldn't lose. The very idea of surrender sent shivers of rebellion through me. Gathering my thoughts, I prepared to stand and speak, hoping to reclaim the narrative. I resolved to expose Thompson's deceptions and bolster my own truthfully, to see him whisper something to his followers who had nestled themselves in the back of the room. Their eyes glinted with a wicked intensity, and it sent a chill crawling down my spine. Had the stakes just escalated once more? Could the courtroom become an arena for more than just words? Perhaps even ritual? The last moments before vocalizing my defiance hung precariously like the dark clouds threatening to storm over us, tantalizing and ripe with possibility. I felt an overwhelming urge to lift my voice above the chaos. But first, I needed to understand the truth that had slipped through my fingers too many times. What I didn't know then was that the battle ahead would eclipse all I had endured, inciting a reckoning that would entwine our fates more than I ever could have conjured in nightmares. The evening wore on, the sun disappearing behind a veil of dark clouds, casting an unsettling shadow over my life. I sat hunched over my laptop at the kitchen table, consumed by a restless determination to reclaim my home. My fingers danced across the keyboard, frantically searching for the history of the land I had unwittingly become a prisoner of. Every click and scroll revealed a tangled web of past occurrences, interwoven with Mr. Thompson's sinister dealings that left a sour taste in my mouth. Each bit of information I uncovered only solidified the chilling grip the cult, especially their enigmatic leader, had over my life, taunting me from the confines of my own backyard. As I scoured through archived newspapers and local lore, pieces started to fall into place. I discovered that my property was not just a house, it had once been a notorious site for rituals led by a fringe group that believed it was a portal to other states of consciousness. They had persistently come back to reclaim what they believed was their sacred ground, and here I was, standing in their way. I couldn't help but notice the eerie similarities between their fervor and the cunning charm of Mr. Fervor. Thompson, who had practically ushered me into this mess with a smirk on his face. Did he know all along about this cursed past, or was he just another pawn in this perplexing game? Fueled by this newfound knowledge and unwilling to back down, I decided to confront Mr. Thompson directly. I found him at a local bar, a notorious gathering spot for those looking to drown their troubles in overpriced drinks. The dim light cast an unsettling glow across his sharp features as he nestled comfortably in a corner booth, surrounded by an array of eager listeners hanging on his every word. I could sense his self-satisfaction radiating through the air as I approached, but the moment I slid into the booth, I knew this was a fight I could no longer avoid. I was ready. "Mr. Thompson," I began, my voice steady but laced with unresolved emotions. "I need answers. You've manipulated not just the sale of this house, but the history tied to it. I won't let you use your charm and deceit to keep me quiet any longer." My heart raced, anticipation mingling with anger, as I desperately sought the truth behind the ancient bond he had spoken of in court. I'd never seen someone switch from charming banker to arrogant predator so swiftly. The lust for power shone in his narrowed eyes as he leaned in closer, attempting to intimidate me into submission. "Ah, don't be so naive," he sneered, a calculating smile subtly forming on his lips. "You see, you were chosen, just as that property was chosen long ago. There's a pact, an ancient binding agreement that you could never begin to grasp." My stomach churned at his words, and the air around us thickened with tension, as if the universe held its breath waiting for me to react. Was this really happening? Had I been unwittingly swept into a world where the supernatural rebirthed its grip over mortal affairs? A snarl of indignation bubbled up within me, forcing its way to the surface. You think this is a game? I shot back, unwavering in my conviction. You are nothing but a charlatan, hiding behind the guise of a legitimate businessman. I won't let you scare me away. I will fight back. I felt emboldened by the truth I had gathered, unearthing the darkness that wrapped itself around Thompson had sparked a fire within me. I was no longer just a victim. I was now an adversary, and I would confront this evil at all costs. In the pursuit of reclaiming my sanity and my home, I pushed him further, demanding more information and exposing the cracks in his facade. Each question felt like a thunderbolt, and for a split second, I could see the cracks forming in his carefully constructed mask of confidence. But just as soon, he regained his composure, a snake slipping away at the last moment. You understand nothing? He spat, his voice low and dangerous. This isn't just about you or your mortgage, madam. This involves forces far beyond human understanding. The implication hung in the air like a storm cloud, suffocating what little hope I had left. Our encounter felt less like a conversation, and more like a duel of wills. Veiled threats whispered beneath a layer of respectability, as others in the bar watched with barely concealed fascination. I could sense the energy shift, every eye on us, lingering on the escalating tension, like a slow-burning fuse awaiting ignition. My heart raced, resolute against the illusion he had crafted around him, and I felt the weight of the room pushing against me, as if it was rooting for me to land a decisive blow. It was only when the clock struck midnight that I ultimately rose from the booth, leaving Thompson simmering in his own self-importance. The night air was cold, refreshing against my heated skin. I left the bar with more questions than answers, but a certainty surged through my veins. I was done being a victim. I had cornered the beast tonight, and I was ready to delve deeper into the labyrinthine history I had unearthed. Now armed not only with knowledge but also with a new resolve, I could feel the weight of my experiences morphing into something potent, something warrior-like. This was only the beginning. The rage simmering within me was more than enough fuel to drive me onward. I would bring Mr. Thompson and his cult crashing down, reveal the absurdity of their claims to anyone who would listen, and ultimately reclaim my home from the shadows that had claimed it for too long. But first, I needed to unravel the ancient secrets he guarded so jealously. What struck me as I walked away was this. In this fight, I was no longer alone. Each night that passed with the robed figures chanting in my backyard felt like a call to arms, an echo of defiance that wouldn't die. I had my ground, and now it was time to reclaim it. Dawn was breaking on the day of the press conference, and a soft light spilled into my living room, illuminating the carefully arranged stack of evidence I had prepared. I had finally decided to take back my life, and it felt as though I was standing at the edge of a precipice, ready to leap into the unknown. As I glanced at the gathering crowd outside, my heart raced with anticipation and fear, their murmurs mixing into a cacophony that mirrored the chaos in my mind. The time had come to confront Mr. Thompson with all the dark truths surrounding his machinations and the cult that claimed my home as their sacred ground. When I stepped out into the brightening day, the media's cameras flashed like the strobe of an angry storm, and the murmuring crowd fell to a hush as I approached the podium. I took a deep breath, feeling a mix of adrenaline and resolve surge through me. As I laid out the sordid tale of my harrowing struggle, the details of the shady dealings I uncovered, I felt the weight of my fears lift with each word I spoke. They no longer belonged to me. I talked about the ruthless tactics of Mr. Thompson, how he had manipulated the sale and exploited the fears of the cult to maintain his power, and his apparent mastery over the local community's perception of his innocence. With focused determination, I shared every detail. The bizarre rituals that plagued my backyard, the notes and threats I had received, and the unsettling way the cult had latched onto my life. The murmurs from the crowd swelled into gasps and outrage, igniting a firestorm of interest that would soon be hard for anyone to ignore. As I pointed to the photographs of Mr. Thompson mingling with the cultists, the absurdity of his lies hung heavy in the air. Did he really believe he could continue pulling the strings unnoticed? It was time everyone knew who he truly was, a charlatan living in the shadows of his own deceit. When Mr. Thompson finally arrived, the tension in the air shifted ominously. He strutted towards the podium with his trademark confident smirk, but this time, it faltered when he faced not just me, but the probing cameras and the increasingly hostile audience. There would be no easy escape. He was cornered, and I could see the flickers of panic flash across his eyes as I laid out my case. The arrogance that had once surrounded him dissolved under the weight of evidence. Each point I made chipped away at his facade until he looked like just another man caught in the web of his own lies. As I unveiled the evidence of his shady real estate practices, I could feel the crowd reacting, tight whispers building into loud bursts of indignation. The roar of their outrage felt like a victory hadn't just deceived me and my family. He had betrayed their entire community. I pressed on, and it felt as if the last vestiges of his control were slipping away, replaced by sheer desperation as I insisted that there was no sanctity in his claims to proprietary authority over my land. In that moment, I reclaimed not just my own truth, but a shared one. When the press conference ended, chaos erupted into the air, the hum of fury and disbelief surging throughout the crowd. Mr. Thompson stood frozen, his carefully crafted image shattered, and I felt a profound sense of accomplishment wash over me. All the sleepless nights spent unraveling his web of lies finally bore fruit. Just then, a solemn figure from the local authorities stepped forward, announcing that they had initiated a multi-agency investigation due to the public outcry and credible evidence I had assembled. At that moment, the world felt lighter. The chains binding my sanctuary began to loosen. Mr. Thompson, who once seemed untouchable, was now faced with a reckoning. The cult, too, found themselves exposed and vulnerable, their stranglehold weakened. As I left the podium, the gravity of what I had achieved began to sink in. I had turned the tables. My sanctuary was now reclaiming its identity, unburdened by the whispers and fears of the past. I could finally envision a peaceful existence devoid of eerie chants and dark figures lurking in my garden. Walking home, I marveled at how far I had come. The road to reclaiming my life had been convoluted and difficult, but courage rose from within me, defining me in ways I had never anticipated. What had once felt like a cursed property now breathed possibilities again, and I was ready to forge memories untainted by fear. In the end, it was his arrogance that proved to be his undoing, making way for a new dawn not just for me, but for anyone else who had faced the tyranny of manipulation and deceit. What remained was a promise of bravery, victory, and a home finally reclaimed.